beer, wine, tequila, whiskey. I'm sure you've heard of these things, but do you actually know the difference between all of the different alcohol and what makes them so different and unique? Well, in this video, I'm gonna be going through every single type of alcohol, hopefully giving you an understanding of what all of these things are. But all right, let's get right into it. First, I want to talk about what alcohol is. Well, alcohol is a substance that is created when yeast, which is this little like microbacteria, like tiny little invisible little creature, eats sugar inside of something and turns that into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide kind of goes off into the space and the alcohol kind of stays in there. And that process is called fermentation. And that is the basis of all alcohol, or at least the drinking alcohol as we know it. The first kind of big category of things that we're going to talk about is fermented beverages. Wine, you have grapes. So you take grapes, you mush them up, they have natural sugars in there, and then the yeast comes in, starts to eat the sugars, releases alcohol, boom, you have wine. Yeast is also natural. It doesn't have to be scientific. Like there's yeast everywhere, like out in the world in the ether. There might be yeast behind you right now and you wouldn't know. But no, it's a naturally occurring thing and things can naturally ferment. And one of the fascinating things about wine, and actually most spirits and alcohol out there, is that the different species of what you're using will have an end result on the final product. You have Merlot, you have Malbec, Cabernet Sauvignon, and all of these are different types of grapes and they will have a different flavor profile. Just a brief aside, wine isn't always necessarily from grapes. Like you can make apple wine and like pear wine. It's still technically called a wine, but we don't really like in our colloquial speak call it that, which is a little confusing, but you know, whatever. Beer is a very similar thing. A lot of beer is made with grain. Basically, you take a grain, you kind of mush it up, put a little bit of water in it, and then it'll start to naturally ferment. And then there you have beer. It's another simple process, but with beer, there's a couple more ingredients. Like the German law for beer was it could only have 4 ingredients, which is water, hops, a grain, and then I forget, oh, and then yeast, obviously the 4th one. A couple of other places make beer a little bit differently, but that's kind of the main basis of it. You also have like sake, which is made from rice. They call it kind of like rice wine. And then there was also pulque, which is made from agave. So that kind of covers fermented beverages. And that just covers it a little bit because now we have to go on to distilled beverages. In distillation, you basically take a fermented beverage, you make it get really hot and it starts to evaporate. The premise is that alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than the rest of the liquid. So you're able to basically evaporate off some of the water and some of the alcohol, and then it goes up this big tube, they then cool it down, and then it pops out the other side and starts dripping, and that is just more of like a pure alcohol or a more concentrated alcohol. So with distillation, you're able to get a much higher alcohol by volume content. So I'm gonna use the example of wine. It's already fermented, it's at about 12, 13%. So let's say you took this, you cooked it in a still, you evaporated the alcohol, and then you distilled it and turned it into a distilled spirit, you would get what is known as a brandy. The word brandy means a distilled beverage from wine. A wine is technically anything that is made with pears, apples, and things like that. You have pear brandy or apple jack or apple brandy. Now, a very specific example is pisco. So pisco is a brandy that is made in Peru and also sometimes Chile, depending on who you ask. But it's essentially this direct correlation. So you have a wine that's made from grapes, it is distilled, it then becomes a pisco. Pisco is very fascinating because it can only be made with 5 different types of grapes, and it has to come out at this very specific ABV because it can only be distilled once. A lot of spirits can be distilled many times. I do have a whole video on what pisco is if you want to learn more about that, but let's move along to other spirits. And just a fun little aside about the word spirits, it has a really funny origin, is that when people started drinking distilled beverages, basically people got really drunk and started acting crazy. And so they thought, oh, there's no way that they're drunk. They didn't really know what that was. They were just like, oh my God, they're possessed. So let's call all of these things spirits, which is great. I find that very funny. So back to our beer example. If beer is basically fermented grain juice, then whiskey is kind of like the next evolution of that, or the distilled version of that. And another fun thing, another little aside about this, I love fermentation. All right, I get very excited about it. Fermentation isn't just in liquid things. If you've ever made bread or any type of dough, that is fermented. So that is actually making alcohol, but then when you cook it, you're basically evaporating all the alcohol out. So what I'm trying to say is that whiskey is liquid bread. Whiskey is any spirit that is distilled from a grain alcohol source. In the case of bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn. In the case of rye, it has to be at least 51% rye. But then in the case of like Scotch, it can be made with malted barley, more normally known as malt. So basically anything that comes from a grain. So anything that you can make a bread out of, you can make a whiskey out of. So if whiskey is made out of grain, then what about rum? Well, rum is super fascinating. Rum is anything that comes from the basis of sugar cane. The process is you take sugar cane, you squeeze it, you take the juice, and you spin it around really fast and get it really hot, and then it separates and becomes a crystallized sugar, and then you're left over with molasses. So you have two things that happen when you make sugar. You have actual sugar and molasses. Rum, as we know it, was actually distilled from fermented molasses. So during the big sugarcane push in like the early 1700s, sugarcane was brought from Asia. They planted it in South and Latin America and throughout the Caribbean, and it grew like crazy. It then became a huge push for the sugar trade, which was one of the biggest contributors to the slave trade. Another fun fact. But in the Caribbean, they would make a ton of sugar and they'd have these big vats of molasses. And that molasses would sit in the hot sun all day and it would ferment. The slaves would start drinking this fermented molasses to get them drunk. And then the people who own the plantations were like, if they're enjoying that, maybe we can distill that. And that's kind of where rum comes from. We also have what is called rum agricole, which is how the French in the Caribbean started making their rum, as well as cachaça, which is Brazilian rum. Now, these two all come from freshly pressed sugarcane juice, which is high in sugar, obviously. And so that just naturally ferments and you get a funkier, more like grassy vegetal flavor than say like a traditional rum made from molasses. But then you also have something really fascinating like Mexican charanda, or at least in the example of Uruapan, they make this rum with a mixture of 50% molasses-based rum and a 50% fresh sugarcane rum, and they create charanda, which is a specific Mexican type of rum. The thing that's very fascinating about rum is that there's a lot of different variations based on where the rum is made, because all of this stuff is agricultural products and a lot of that stuff has an impact on it. And so what about tequila? Well, I'm gonna talk about tequila and mezcal at the same time. Both of these spirits come from Mexico and they are made from the agave plant. Big, old, tall, giant, dinosaur-looking plant, and they cook it, they then ferment it, and they distill it. I have a whole video right over here that you can check out on how tequila is actually made, and a whole explanation in another video that I'll link down below that goes really through the whole process. But the big difference between these two spirits is a couple of things. One is the species of the agave that is used to make the end spirit, as well as the method and manner of cooking. Those are the two kind of big ones. There's more differences. Please don't start yelling at me in the comments, but those are kind of the basic ones. Tequila can only be made from the blue Weber agave, and then mezcal can be made from like I think 30 other different species of agave. And usually tequila is cooked in steam ovens or in above ground ovens, whereas mezcal traditionally is cooked in like an earthen pit, so it gets kind of smoky from the fact that the smoke can't leave there. So it's kind of like a pig roast in Hawaii, if you've ever heard of that. And so you guys might be thinking to yourself, well, we got into all these crazy things, but what about the most common ones like vodka? Well, let's talk about it. So vodka, by definition, or at least the American definition for a very long time, was that it was a flavorless, odorless, colorless spirit. So meaning it was neutral, it was devoid of anything. It was just basically a distilled alcohol that was around 40% ABV, which actually now is probably a good time to mention this. Distilled spirits can usually range anywhere between like 35 all the way to, I mean, actually up to like 80 something, which is crazy. Not many things go up that high, but most of them will be around 40%. In the US, there's a law that anything that is under 40%, it cannot be considered a spirit. It has to be considered a liqueur. I don't know, it's just random. But anyway, back to vodka. Vodka is colorless, flavorless, odorless by definition. And in theory, it can be made from anything, actually. Most traditional vodkas, you might have heard that it's made from like potatoes or things like that, but technically you can make it out of anything as long as you remove all of the flavors and aromas to it. And how they do it is usually by just distilling it many, many times. So the more times you distill something, so you'll see some vodkas that are like, oh, like 17 times distilled. Every time you distill, you're removing some of the flavor and some of the aroma. So a lot of vodkas will be distilled many times, and then water will be added back in so that it's basically just a flavorless, odorless, colorless spirit. But in this case here, St. George, the only vodka that I carry, because I'm actually usually very against vodka, they're the exception, is that theirs starts off as a pear brandy. This pear brandy, I believe. They then distill it a couple more times until it gets to the level of being a vodka. But this one does carry like a tiny amount of pear flavor in there. All right, Louis, that's cool, but what about gin? Well, gin is one of the very old and historic spirits. And gin started off as Juniper or Juniper. I always forget how to pronounce it, but basically it's a Dutch spirit that used to be made from grains, and they would add juniper to it. Juniper is a little berry that gives gin its very particular flavor. So it's kind of like a whiskey in a way, so it's made from grains. They then add juniper to it after it's distilled, and it gets this fun, interesting kind of malty, juniper-y flavor. The British really loved gin, and they were like, well, we want to make this at home, but they didn't have a great selection of grains. So they just started making gin with whatever they had. And then they would just add juniper to it, and that's kind of where London dry style gins came about. And so today, gin can be made from literally anything as long as juniper is added and other botanicals are infused. And just to prove the point about you can make gin with anything, one of my favorite producers, St. George, they make this dry rye gin. So it's a rye whiskey that's unaged that they then turn into a gin, which is pretty cool. And then we can start getting into the world of liqueurs, which are usually distilled spirits that then have some sort of flavor added by maceration or by adding different things to it. So you have like Cointreau, which is an orange-based liqueur. And then you also have like dry Curacao, which is similar to a Cointreau, but the difference is that this is cognac-based. And cognac is a brandy that was made in the Cognac region of France and aged for a specific amount of time. This is made from grapes in the specific region of Cognac in France. But the dry Curacao is a liqueur that is made with the basis of it being cognac, and then there's oranges added to it after it's been distilled. And then you can just kind of go crazy with liqueurs. I have, for example, we have like a banana liqueur. So it's like a liqueur that is infused with the flavor of bananas, and it kind of goes from there. There's a lot of crazy ones. And so I hope all of this up until this point has been kind of hopefully easy enough to follow, but now we're gonna get into the crazy ass world of Amari or Amaro. Amari are a type of alcoholic beverage that is usually distilled to a certain point, and then it is infused with different herbs, spices, and kind of whatever, and they get kind of very funky and crazy, and there's no real like set way on how to make them with a bunch of different recipes. So you have like Fernet, which is a hugely popular Amaro, which has a bunch of different ingredients that I don't really know what it is, but then you have like Chinar, which is made from artichokes, and these are usually of Italian origin, that's where it kind of started, but there's a lot of other ones as well. For example, the one I have here, the Amaro Rosso, is actually made here in Boston, just up the road from me. I say just up the road, it's like 35 minutes, but it's here. This is something similar to like a red aperitif, kind of like Campari, similar to it. But each one, again, is just made with a bunch of different herbs and spices and things like that. And these are super varied, so they can taste completely different from one another, but usually an underlying link is that they're a little bit bitter and there's some like herbs and spices. And so hopefully this video gave you a little bit of insight into the different types of alcohol, and hopefully it gave you a little bit more understanding of what the differences between each of these things are. And I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to know more about any of these specific spirits, I have some links down below that you can watch next. And we'll catch you in the next one. Laters.